The start of every summer, me and my friends Sam and Dave take a kayak trip upriver and find a place to camp and do a little fishing. We've been doing this since we were children, when we would come up with our fathers. Now that the three of us are grown, we've continued the tradition. It was a Saturday. We decided to head out. I picked up Sam, we grabbed some supplies at the store, then got Dave and headed toward the river. We were on the river by 1 o'clock, and by 3, we reached the cove we always stopped at. We pulled the kayaks up on land and walked a few feet into the woods, where we set up camp in the small clearing we always use. It had looked like someone had recently been here, which was strange because we didn't think anyone else knew about this place. The sun was starting to set, so Sam and Dave set up the tents, and I started up the fire and began to cook supper. We sat around the fire catching up on each other's lives over the past year and reminiscing of old times. As we were talking, Sam brought up the snuffed-out fire that was here before we set up camp. As we were in the middle of talking about it, we could hear a branch snap in the distance. Sam jumped up quick. "Who's out there?" he shouted. "We have a gun. Show yourself or leave us alone." We waited a few seconds, and nothing. Just then a squirrel came out of the darkness. We howled in laughter. "Oh, Sam, look at that scary creature there. Better get your gun before it gets you," me and Dave joked. "Also, what the hell is wrong with you, Sam? We don't have a gun. Don't say that crap." "Yeah, well, if someone was out there, it would be better if they thought we did." We laughed off the noise and enjoyed the night, drinking and telling stories. Then after a few hours, I went to my tent and passed out. I had the most realistic nightmare. A woman in black came into my tent and started whispering, but it was in a language I couldn't understand. She had an axe in her hand. Then she turned and left my tent. I sat up and looked outside. I saw Sam walking back up the trail, probably coming back from using the bathroom. As he was going back into his tent, she came out of nowhere and drove the axe into his skull. Then she went into Dave's tent and did the same to him. I could hear him screaming. Blood was everywhere. The campsite was completely covered. Son, that's quite the story. But there was no sign of a woman. The only footprints at the campsite were yours and your friend's. You're completely covered in your friend's blood, and your fingerprints are all over the axe." "Detective, no! There was a woman! There was a woman!" When I was a kid, my father and I went up into the bush at the back of the farm and set some traps. Dad planned to set the trap line along the top of the bridge, then make camp some distance away, sleep overnight, and clear the traps in the morning. I thought of the trip as a great adventure. It had been quite a climb, because the hill was over 1,000 feet high and the trail was 4 miles long. That's a long trek for a 12-year-old boy. Anyway, Dad set the traps and we made camp in a clearing just as the sun was setting. I was really tired, so I went to bed in the tent straight after dinner. Dad sat on a fallen log by the fire for a while as I lay in the tent. Some time later, I woke briefly and looked out of the tent. Dad was still sitting on the log, looking into the flames. I had no idea what time it was. There was an old man sitting on the other end of the log. I just guessed that the old guy had seen the light of the fire and come into camp for some company. Dad and the old man were sitting there in silence, both looking at the fire. I went back to sleep. In the morning, I asked Dad who the old man was, only to be asked, "What old man?" I described the man to Dad: tall, broad-shouldered, gray beard, one finger missing from the left hand. Black trousers, tramping boots, a blue jersey, and a wide-brimmed leather hat. Dad got very quiet and just looked at me for a moment. "I know who you're talking about now," he said finally. "That was old Tom Doherty. He went up in the forest hereabouts back in 1946 and never came out again." "Could he still be living up here?" I asked Dad. "He was in his 60s back in 46, Dad said. "If he was alive now, he'd be over 100 years old." "No, he's long gone." I made up a story, and now it's come true. We were all sharing supposedly scary stories, so I made one up about Sister Jude, a disgraced nun with an upside-down face. Everyone was super scared. They all wanted to hear more about her. So I went on. Sister Jude was cruel to the children in the orphanage she ran. Wicked even. That's what I told my friends. I spoke about how one day the kids fought back, killing her and burying her in the crawl space. The thing is, I told them that her ghost lived on. Now her deformed, inverted face haunts the site of her death, with maggot-white flesh and cracked black cavities for eyes. I told them how she would snap and grind her fingernails into the floorboards above her burial site, dragging her claws across the wood. That is what she does before she comes for you. The one thing I shouldn't have said is that the orphanage was once located where we were sitting, sharing our stories. Now they are gone, and in this big, empty, darkened house, the only thing I can hear is the scratching beneath my feet. The camping trip started off the way they always do when you're 17. 5 of us rolling up in a minivan loaned out by apprehensive parents, rattly taking corners and blaring music, passing joints and sipping warm beer. Not a care in the world. The scenery around us turned more and more rural, farms eventually giving way to dense forest. Through all the laughter and conversation, I still got an uneasy feeling as soon as the mountain came into view. Something about it made my skin crawl, but it was only for a second, and no one else seemed to feel it, so I let it go. We took a dirt road that was parallel to a wide stream off the east side of the mountain, and eventually we saw the cabin that James had talked up so much. "Hey, it's still here!" he exclaimed, while Sarah jarred us with her braking. We excitedly crawled out, myself, Dom, Carrie, and Sarah, taking in the sight. For all of the shit James could talk, he had been entirely accurate in his description. This was his grandfather's old cabin, built in the early 40s, a place he had retreated to after his wife had passed, to find some peace. He couldn't have picked a better place for it. I hoped I would find a similar peace. I had been stuck in a rut the last few months. After much prodding from James, I had agreed to go. Looking around me at the beautiful landscape, I was glad he convinced me. It felt almost sacred. Not that we treated it that way. James hurriedly got a fire going in the pit, and soon we were all fairly hammered. Dom and Carrie had been snuggling up since we got in the van and retreated into the cabin for a while. I plopped myself in front of the fire as the chilly air started to bite, and listened to James go on and on. I loved the guy, but he was always such a loud mouth. I smirked at Sarah, who was clearly his intended audience. She rolled her eyes and chuckled as his seemingly endless rant continued. "Damn, give it a rest already," Dom hollered as he and Carrie returned from the cabin, with huge grins on their faces. James stopped talking and looked slightly embarrassed. "All right, but hey, someone had to drown out you two," he quipped back. Dom laughed and shoved him lightly, taking a seat next to him, Carrie on his other side. "So who has a good ghost story?" James asked, looking around at us eagerly. I shook my head. It was too corny, not my thing. Not getting the reaction he had hoped for, James decided it was up to him to regale us once more. "All right, okay, I've got it." He glanced at Sarah to make sure she was into it. She didn't seem against it. I groaned. This was going to be long-winded for sure. "The important thing," James started, his tone now very serious, "is that we all keep our eyes closed." "I'm not doing that," Carrie said flatly. "Come on, Carrie, it'll be worth it. I promise it's a good one." James was so eager to tell his story, he was practically begging. "No way, dude. You're just going to grab us or something. I'm not falling for it." She was just as adamant. "I swear, I won't do anything like that." He crossed his heart. Carrie glanced over at Dom, who seemed interested in hearing the story. She sighed and crossed her arms. "Fine." James beamed at her and rubbed his hands together. I finished my beer, trying to act like I wasn't just as nervous as Carrie. The mountain was right behind us. That uneasiness I felt in the van crept back into my mind as I felt its presence looming over us. Now this is serious. Once our eyes are closed, there is absolutely no opening them until it's over. It will ruin it. James drove this point home again. His face was covered by shadow, his voice much lower than before. He was really getting into character. We all agreed to humor him. I took one last look at everyone before we shut our eyes. James began his tale. Deep in these woods, up on the mountain, there was a shadow that lived among the trees. It was a sinister spirit that fed off of fear, latching on to anyone who was unfortunate enough to come across it. The shadow stayed with you until it had robbed you of your life, leaving behind empty husks of people, taking away anything you had inside you except for pain and fear. As it consumed lives, it grew into more than a mere shadow. James sounded like he was on the other end of a tunnel. The creature was strong enough now that it started assuming a physical form. It walked freely from the forest and no longer needed to slip between shadows or move under darkness. It stalked its prey right up to their cottages, would wait outside their doors at night and whisper to them in their dreams. The victims would try their best to ignore what was happening to them. They tried to believe that it was just nightmares, that they were simply hearing the whispers of the wind. This would go on for months, as the creature wanted his prey to be ripe with terror when it came to harvest them. The fire was no longer warming me. Shivers were running down my spine, and the urge to open my eyes was overwhelming. I wondered if everyone was still keeping their word. When it came to harvest, James' voice was now distorted. It sounded demonic in every right. It would appear to you as a human. It was very smart. It would take its time and pretend to be a friend. You would spend so much time around it, never realizing what it was. As soon as you saw it in its true form, your soul was taken. The horror of seeing this creature was too great to survive. My heart was slamming against my ribs. And now you know. The voice speaking was not James. I was sure of it. I had to know who was across from me. Do you dare open your eyes? She never expected this, flesh giving away to a knife. What she really didn't expect was that knife to be held by her husband. A few minutes later, a complimentary thought walked unbidden to her mind. I guess he got his pound of flesh. Who would have thought that there were thoughts of murder marinating in his office room? Hatred came whistling through in the shape of a knife thrust. Gone were the days when he used to tilt his heart in her direction. He used to say, I can be polite or compassionate, or I can tell you the truth, but the truth is neither. That was a truffle of truth she failed to bite. Dutiful as ever, she obeyed his command to bleed to death. As she turned her eyes to the night sky so she could be spared his face, she thought she saw a star twinkling in the dark as she bled her last. But what it really was were two angels around a campfire, looking down from the heavens at her. Just two angels enjoying the warmth of a fire in a cold sky, with no inkling of a desire to help. Thank you for joining me. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and maybe even share my videos with your friends. Until next time.